I'll slightly touch on participatory methods as well. I'll not be able to get into details of participatory methods, but at least I'll give a brief overview in terms of these methods as well. Okay, so we'll begin, and I'll start with the focus group method. Now, so when you look at focus group, basically, it's a very interesting method. So focus group, interestingly, sits at this intersection of, communication, psychology, sociology, and even policy research. So in focus group, you are collecting, of course, people's opinions, their perspectives, all the information, factual information that people would be giving. But interestingly, what makes focus groups interesting is that through this method, you are also able to observe how opinions are formed in a group, right? And that's the beauty of focus groups as a method. So we'll discuss what I mean by formulation of opinions in a focus group method. Subsequently, I'll do it in a couple of more slides. But I thought let's begin with a few examples. Now, the first example here is from the US, and so in the US, when Coca-Cola, I'm sure everybody knows of Coca-Cola, they wanted to test a new formula for Coke, right? And in order to test that formula, they did not simply give the product to their consumers and distribute a questionnaire which people had to fill. Instead, what they did is they brought a group of people on board, and they showed this product, people tasted this product, and then in a group they were asked to share their opinion. Now that is an example of focus group. Similarly, if you look at the second example here, it says a group discusses how media messages are explored by audiences and how understanding of say suppose a disease like AIDS is constructed, or even for instance, how do people understand any aspect related to health, say suppose mental health issues, how do different audiences understand mental health issues, right? Again, that can be done through a focus group. The next example here says different sections of the Lancashire public were sought to cast light on their development, on their understanding of and identification with what is called a sustainable development. Again, done collectively in a group where people are brought together in order to share their opinion. And lastly, I've given an example here where two groups in UK, one of children and other of parents, discuss issues about access, quality, opportunities, and risk associated with children's use of internet. Now, these are all examples of focus group. And just to give you a couple of more examples closer home, from my own work. So I did this, I've mentioned about one of the projects that I was a part of. It was on women domestic workers. So in women domestic workers project that Tata Institute did, we again employed focus groups in order to understand issues of women, the issues that women face, particularly at their workplace and within the domestic sphere. As well as to understand the level of awareness women had with respect to their rights, with respect to their citizen rights. How much information did they have in terms of what documents they need to have as citizens, and how easy or difficult was it for them to access formal institutions, whether it was bank, whether it was the police station, etc. So for all of this information, again, the method of focus group was employed. In my own MPhil research, which I did in MP in Satpura, I used focus group with a couple of villages that I studied in order to understand how different villages differently articulated their understanding of the resettlement that they had to go through because of the protected area coming up. And very recently, in one of the protected areas in Uttar Pradesh, it's in Sohelwa. Again, focus group as a method was used in this project where women from different social categories were brought together. And what we were trying to understand through these focus groups was basically the level of understanding of women in terms of the surrounding forests. What is the value of the forest? What is the legal status of the forest that they live around, and as well as the impact of different development projects on the forest, as well as on the condition of the women themselves there. Now, if you look closely, if you understand closely these different examples of focus group, in all cases, please understand that it's a collective process of meaning making. right? So collective process of meaning making about a particular phenomena. So people are collectively coming together and trying to understand, formulate a meaning about whatever is being studied. It could be, issues with respect to children's use of internet. It could be about, forest related issues. It could be about domestic work related issues, anything, right? But the main crux is that it's a collective process. Okay. Now, so if you've understood this, David Morgan, who's basically the, one of the most famous and influential methodologists in terms of focus groups, he's defined focus groups as a form of qualitative research, which is basically group interviews, although it is not in the sense of an alteration between the researcher's questions and the research participants' responses. That's not how it is. Instead, the reliance in a focus group is on the interaction within a group, right? Based on the topics that are supplied by the researcher, who typically takes the role of a moderator. Now, let's just break this down. Some of the important features that stand out for focus groups compared to other methods is that when you look at focus group, these are group interviews along with being focused interviews. Now, what do you mean by group interviews and focused interviews? Now, when you say group interviews, so unlike the in-depth one-to-one in-depth interviews that we had done in the second session, focus groups usually happen, as I said, in groups. And most ideally, it's about 6 to 7 people in a group, because more than that, your group becomes messy. The research process becomes messy for the moderator to handle. So usually, it's never one-to-one. In a focus group, there will be a couple of people. And as I said, about 6 to 7 people. The second is, unlike unstructured interviews, which are more closer to informal conversations, focus groups are very, very specific in their approach, right? That is to say that they have a very clearly defined topic on which people talk, or there is a very clearly defined research problem around which the conversation happens, right? That's why they're group interviews, but they're also focused interviews. But the most important aspect of focus groups is that, yes, there is a focus on what is being said, right? But more importantly, as I mentioned in the beginning, in focus group, it's about how people co-create meaning, right? Which is to say that how do they interact with each other, or what is the dynamics of the group that is interacting? What is the dynamics of this group that's come together for the focus group? And in this dynamics, how is certain kind of meaning created? How does certain kind of meaning emerge in the conversation, right? And that's the focus of a method like focus groups, right? So yes, facts, what people are saying, their opinions, their perspectives, their experiences, everything is important. That has to be noted. But equally crucial in focus group is to see how in a conversation people form certain meanings. How do people change certain meanings? How do they negotiate meanings of certain aspects? How do they resist, or how do they stabilize certain meanings, right? So the focus is really on those aspects of the dynamics of the group, which leads to a collective or a mutual understanding about something, right? And if that is the case, the researcher here is not an interrogator. In interviews, in in-depth interviews particularly, you're an interrogator. You're basically asking questions, right? In focus groups, you're not asking questions in the same way, but you basically take on the role of what is called as a moderator. So you're basically only moderating the discussion that is going on between people, right? So you don't talk to people, or people don't talk to you like in an interview. What they do is they talk to each other, and my role as a researcher is to facilitate that discussion that happens between people, right? So my role changes drastically compared to what it is in a in-depth interview. Is everybody with me till here? Yeah. All right, great. Now, a little bit about the history of focus groups as well. Now, see, if you look at group interviews, group interviews are, have been used since a very long time, since 1920s, right? But there have been issues with group interviews, and therefore, it's in context of that focus group comes comes to light as alternatives to group interviews, with very specific care being given to ensure that the research process is less hierarchical and it is less researcher dominated, right? And I'm sure you would have understood by now when I'm saying that the researcher is a moderator, that the idea in focus group is to decenter control, right? Now, if you look at history of focus group, the earliest use of focus groups happened during the World War II time period, right? And it was basically done to understand and to examine the persuasiveness of wartime propaganda efforts in the US, right? And if you look at studies, then Merton and Lazarsfeld, who are basically pioneers of the focus group method, used focus group in order to understand how people responded to radio programs that were designed to boost morale in the army, right? So basically, at that point of time, in US, during the wartime, of course, radio programs were designed, right, which is specifically targeting the army personnel in order to boost their morale for the war. And what Merton and Lazarsfeld did is basically to have focus group with these personnel in order to understand whether these programs were effective enough to persuade people or to motivate people to go to war. Now, this was the first time that focus groups were used, and Merton then, of course, took up this method and this idea to use group strategies, right, in order to assess people's attitudes and opinions. And he continued with what is basically called as the radio response project. If somebody is interested in focus groups and how it was used earlier, you can probably do a little bit of Google search on the radio response project. Now, so there is a lot of weight, there is a lot of usefulness in the method in terms of specifically understanding people's opinions and how opinions are formulated. Yet focus group as a method has largely remained overshadowed by other methods, particularly quantitative methods, like surveys, basically, until the 1970s in academic research. However, marketing field has really taken to focus groups, right? Within social sciences, it's around the 1970s only that active use of focus groups started. And of course, by 80s and 90s, a variety of academic fields such as communication studies, education, political science, public health, etc. And now, of course, it's across the board that the method is used, right? Now, if you also want to understand the uses of focus group, particularly if you look at marketing research, because that's where it is most widely used. So then in marketing research, focus groups are used as primary tools, preliminary tools, I'm sorry, right? And for example, the case that I gave, the first example that I gave of the testing of the new formula of Coke, right? Now, in marketing, that's a method. Focus group can be used as a method in order to test certain products before they're launched in the market, right? So how are people responding to certain trends? How are people responding to certain, fashion changes, for instance, or certain, technological changes that are being brought in. So for all of those aspects, marketing research has really made good use of focus groups. It's needless to say, of course, it needs to be testified. The results need to be triangulated, but nevertheless, it's a very good tool as a preliminary tool in order to understand what's the response, how are people responding to certain things, right? Now, as a method, a focus group can be used as a self-contained or as a standalone method, but it can also be used as a supplement to other quantitative and qualitative methods. Now, when I say as a standalone method, now these methods of focus group then are basically useful when your interest as a researcher is really in terms of understanding group dynamics. If that's the focus of your research, trying to understand group dynamics, then this is the most beautiful tool to use, right? Because it helps you understand how people are reacting to each other. How are they co-creating meaning? How are they responding to each other, right? To give an example, for instance, if government, launches, say, suppose a women's self-help group livelihood program, right? And if you do like a survey or if you do a quick research, you find out that this particular program for this particular group, the participation rates are great, Their repayment rates are spot on, and even their incomes have risen significantly. So on the whole, the group is doing fantastic, right? So by that standard, yes, this particular program that the government has launched has done very well. But now, if you change your method and you say, suppose with the same self-help group that's doing great, you use a focus group. It can so happen that during this focus group discussion, say suppose one woman suddenly says, yes, we are doing great, but usually the decisions about loan are taken by two women in our group, right? Which leads another woman to say, basically say that yes, these women lead, and we generally tend to follow them. Somebody else then suddenly speaks up. If you disagree with them, then it gets awkward between the group, and we don't want any troubles. We just listen to them. Finally, somebody can say that sometimes I don't even know what this process of self-help groups is like, but since there are these two women who are leading the group, I don't generally tend to question them or ask them anything. Now, what does that tell you about the group? I'd like to hear from all of you. Does it tell you anything different? You'll have to unmute yourself if you want to speak. No? Okay, somebody sent power dynamics. Absolutely, that's the point. See, that's exactly what I said. When you look at the overall performance of the group, it's great, right? Their repayment is fine, their incomes have increased, they're participating well. But the dynamics of the group, which comes to light only when you're doing this focus group, and it's in the process of, if you do a one-to-one interview, there's a possibility that people might not open up and say all of this, right? But in a group interview, when people are interacting, they say, acha, okay, this person in front of you has also said something, so you feel that, okay, probably you can also express what you truly think about the group. And what emerges in this conversation is that while the group is doing great, not everyone in the group is equal, right? So while your outcomes might indicate that this is the group has done well and the program has been a success, the dynamics of the group reveals something different, right? And that's why as a standalone method, your group interviews become very crucial. Now, I gave you that example of Sohelwa, where we were trying to study people's understanding, specifically women's understanding of the forest around them and the value of the forest. Now, in Sohelwa, when we did this focus group, we were looking at these two social categories of women. One were the Tharu tribe, right, and the other were the scheduled castes. Now, interestingly, in that entire conversation that happened on, the value of the forest, whether it should be protected or not, whether they're, getting any kind of benefit from the forest department, or are they using the resources of the forest, for instance, only one category of women spoke, right? The scheduled tribe women, the Tharu tribe, basically, they did not speak at all. And we were there for about an hour or so. The conversation continued, but they did not speak at all. And it's only subsequently that we realized that there were reasons as to why they did not respond, right? Because they did not find any issues in terms of the forest being there, or any negative impact that, say, suppose the forest would have in terms of reducing their livelihood opportunities, or in terms of reducing access to forests because of the forest department's rules and regulations, because they were supported by other development programs which this other group of women did not have, right? So the dynamics again was very different, which comes to light only when you are in certain settings, right? I hope this is clear. Okay. Now, that is when you're using focus group as a standalone method. But as I said, you can use focus group also as a supplemental method, right? And much like the other methods that we had discussed earlier, focus group is again useful if you want to orient yourself to the fields. When you're new into your field, when you don't know people, when you don't know about the dynamics of this place that you're going to, or the dynamics of the issue that you are trying to study, again, focus group is an interesting tool in terms of helping yourself as a researcher to get to know your field. Now, several times focus group is also used by a lot of quantitative researchers in order to decide on what the hypothesis for their research is going to be. So based on the results, based on the discussion that unfolds in focus group, people are able to use these findings to generate hypotheses, which are then subsequently tested through surveys, etc. Now, thirdly, focus groups are quite useful when you want to compare, right? So say, suppose if I want to compare how younger generation and the older generation respond similarly or differently to, say, suppose a development program, or how men and women respond differently, say, suppose to elections in a particular state, right? Or how do they respond differently to the introduction of digital money, right? So when I want to compare responses, or say, suppose I want to understand the different implementation of a development program in two different villages, right? So across villages, across communities, across social categories, when I'm trying to compare, again, focus groups are quite helpful. So all you have to do is basically get, people who are younger into one focus group, and then people who are elder into one focus group, and then these two separate focus groups will give you different insights in terms of how people are looking at a development program, right? Fourthly, similar to the second one, even in qualitative research, before people decide on their interview schedules, focus groups again can be used as a method in order to identify the key themes that you would want to put into your interview schedules, key themes on which you would want to talk in depth with your respondents of your interview. And lastly, if you want to get participants' observation of results from earlier studies, again, focus groups are fruitful. Now, what does that mean? Basically, you can ask people about their opinion on, say, suppose some previous study that was conducted, or say, suppose for organizations that are joining us today, if you want to, get people's opinion on certain previous projects that had been implemented, you could actually, before initiating a new project and before designing a new project, what you can do is simply just go to people, do a focus group in terms of what were the lacunae, what were the good practices in the earlier projects, right? Which then helps you as an organization also to formulate subsequent projects in a manner which people will take to, right? Is that clear? Yes.
May I ask, please? I've
Yes,
put my
please. Yeah.
question in the chat
Okay.
box.
I'm not able to look at the chat box
Oh,
right now, but if
okay.
you, yeah.
Sure, I can ask it. So
Okay.
I think it was Tuesday that we had our last session,
Okay.
and there was a discussion about how we should strive to ensure that the participants of an FGD don't know each other before they come into the discussion, because there's a chance that
Okay.
their opinions might be influenced, exchanged already, etc. Now, while I understand cognitively what that means, everything that we've considered today, all the uses that we've considered today, uh, don't seem to indicate that. It seems to indicate that it would be good. I mean, it doesn't matter really, because it's another,
Yeah. Right.
it's another instance of interaction, and we are observers, and that can tell us things that we might want be interested in. So I
Correct.
was just wondering if we had the time to briefly consider these two perspectives. Is that an
Right.
industrial setting that we're talking about? Yeah, just
See,
that.
I can share what I feel about this in the sense that, see, um, what you're saying, we will cover that aspect of the dynamics of the group where there is, there's certain people who dominate, that I'll come to. But again, the point is, as I said, when we're looking at focus groups, there are two aspects. One is the information that is being shared, right? And the correctness of the information that is being shared. Now, that, of course, the dynamics of the group, as I said, it's the dynamics of the group which will
Sure.
lead to creation of certain meanings, certain, whatever the perspective that ultimately you take
Got it.
back from the focus group. Now,
Sure.
that may or may not be accurate, which I agree with. And in that case, if that is the only focus with which you want to go to people, in that case, there are these instances where certain people may control. And as a moderator, I should be able to identify that, and that's a skill that the moderator has to bring in, where people who are not responding, who are not able to bring in their perspectives, either are given the platform, or focus group then leads to, say, suppose more in-depth interviews, or you realize that you need to talk to certain people separately. But to say that in a focus group you should never have people who know each other prior to the meeting, maybe not, because as I said, the second use of focus group is when you are trying to really understand the dynamics of the group itself. Yes,
Yeah.
what is being conveyed, yes, is important,
Mm.
but also in
Mm.
terms of how do people interact with each other, how do men interact with women in a village, for instance, in context of
Mm.
a development program. Now, if that is my focus, uh, if that is what I want to understand, then of course they will have to know each other, right?
Yeah.
And in that sense, I don't see that as a problem. It's really in terms of what am I trying to get out of focus groups as a
Mm.
method. That's
Mm.
what I feel. But I'll come to those aspects of controlling as well. I'll come when I discuss the advantages and disadvantages of focus groups, and then maybe we can take it up later. But
Sure. Thank
I
you.
don't think it's particularly important that people should not know each other prior to, um, you know, the focus group. Only if the first point is the only objective with which you go for a focus group, then it becomes a big issue. For which again, you will have ways and means in which you can try to triangulate data and ensure the accuracy of that data.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So moving on. Okay. All right. So these are some of the uses of focus group. Now, the question at hand is that, compared to, say, suppose marketing research, which has really made use of focus groups a lot, why does social science still hesitate, or it doesn't use focus groups as much? Specifically, when you look at academic research, we see a lot of people falling back on in-depth interviews, life stories, narratives, right? Focus group is usually used, never in that sense used as a standalone tool. There are certain reasons as to why marketing has taken to it better than social sciences, right? The first is that what happens usually in several focus groups, you use a stimulus, right? You'll give a stimuli to people to initiate the conversation. So, for instance, in that Coke example, people were given the Coke, right? So they were asked to drink this new formula, and then the conversation was started. Similarly, in a lot of focus group, people actually, show these presentations. They would give like this small presentation before about, say, suppose sustainable development or about mental health issues, about any aspect, right? Or they will show some short films. They can show certain photographs or pictures, or certain objects are shared, and based on these stimuli, then a conversation is initiated. Now, in marketing research, it is easier to present people with these kinds of stimuli, right? In social science, it gets slightly tricky. The second reason is that these are different contexts. In marketing research, mostly people would do focus group, or the agenda in marketing per se is to sell something to people, right? And focus groups then happen with that thought in mind. Social sciences, we're not selling anything, right? And lastly, one of the major issues with respect to focus groups not being used as much is because there are so many other techniques that are available in qualitative, even quantitative methods for that matter, such that focus groups, even when they use them, used basically as a supplemental tool, not as standalone tools, right? Now, moving to some of the advantages of focus groups. If you compare focus group with participant observation, now the first major advantage, right, one of the greatest strength of focus groups is that they allow observation of large amount of interaction on a specific topic in a very short period of time, right? So you can basically access debates amongst people, you can access disagreement, you can access opinions, all of these aspects in a very short period of time. Now, in participant observation, what happens is uh, your observation cannot be very focused, right? Because it's a natural setting. People are just living their life and you have to observe, right? That's why it becomes even more widespread, right? Focus group, because it's focused, it's about a specific topic. That's why observation is allowed on a specific topic, right? The second major advantage compared to participant observation for focus group is that it's obviously easier to organize. You don't have to, unlike participant observation, you don't have to embed yourself in the field for long. So before doing a focus group, it's not mandatory that you should be in the field for 6 months, for 3 months, for a year. You should get to know people very well. You should have that rapport built. All of those aspects, are important, but of course not to the degree as in participant observation. Secondly, also in cases which, as I said in the second session, that cases that are resistant to observation, focus groups again become useful. So I'd given that example of if I want to study veganism, if I want to study vegetarianism, observation is limited, right? How many times can I actually observe people or practicing veganism or vegetarianism? Instead, I can actually just have a group of 5, 6 people who've turned vegan come together, discuss their practices, their routines, why did they do this, the challenges that they face. All of those aspects can, in a very concentrated, focused manner, can be done in a focus group, right? So compared to participant observation, those are the advantages. Of course, there are disadvantages. Obviously, it is less naturalistic, right? And very often, because people know that you are observing them, people know that this is about a particular topic, there is a tendency that people also start putting up a performance, right? They will start behaving in a particular manner. And obviously, compared to participant observation, it is, of course, more controlled by the researcher. The discussion is in control. You're moderating the discussion, right? So it cannot go anywhere in any direction. Ultimately, you are in charge, right? Now, compared to participant observation, that's the disadvantages for focus groups. Now, if you look at individual interviews, again, looking at the advantages of focus groups, the first is that you can observe interactions on a topic and capture spontaneous responses. Now, unlike in an interview where people are talking to you, the researcher, right? Here, people are talking to each other, right? And in talking to each other, they're also responding to what people are saying, right? If I say something, there's somebody else in the focus group who might just suddenly respond to me, right? And in that response, in those responses that people give to each other, you will get spontaneous reactions, right? Now, what these spontaneous reactions do is that they are the natural attitude of people, right? So compared to individual interviews where people know that they're talking to a researcher, here, because people are talking to each other, they're far more frank and far more free, right? So there's always this chance of spontaneity. There is always this chance of feeling at ease in order to communicate, right? Which allows you to capture true or more natural responses. So in a development program, somebody might just say that, okay, nahi, this program was wonderful, or we got all the money, and then somebody can just suddenly jump up and say, अरे नहीं झूठ बोल रहे हैं, वो आधा पैसा तो जो है कोई और ही ले गया था. All of those aspects can come up largely because people are responding to each other and not to you, right? The second advantage is that since as a researcher in a focus group, I'm only a moderator, what I do in that process is I pass the baton to the participants, right? So it decenters control. So people decide how they want to communicate to each other, or what are the aspects that they're trying to highlight, or how are they co-creating meaning amongst each other. And naturally, it's of course also cheaper and faster if you want to access more number of people. In in-depth interviews, you can only do one person at a time. There are disadvantages. The first is, of course, that we have proportionately less data generated. Now, because I'm not doing one-to-one discussion with people, it's a group of people who are talking to each other. The amount of information or the richness of the data, the richness of the conversation that I would otherwise have with one person, of course, that gets compromised, right? So in terms of personal one-to-one conversations or experiences or narratives that people might share in an in-depth interview, that does not necessarily come up in focus groups, or it's very limited. And the second point is what we were just discussing now, which is called group influence. Now, group influence is that very often in focus groups, some people, you will see, for those who've done focus group would already know this, right? There are certain people in a focus group who will dominate the conversation. They'll be the people who will be responding. They'll be the people who will have all the answers. And they most likely will not give others the chance to speak. Now, that's where our roles as moderators come in, right? We have to be quick enough to identify that okay, this conversation is being single-handedly dominated by this one person. I need to intervene to allow other people to speak, intervene to give a platform and time for other people to express their opinions. Now, despite doing that, there is still a problem in terms of whether what is being conveyed is actually the entire group's opinion or not, right? And that's where I say, yes, the opinion, the final meaning that is created is important. But for me as a researcher, focus group also helps me understand the dynamics of this group. Now, to give an example, say suppose I'm having a focus group on exploitation of labor, for instance, in context of say suppose certain scheme that has been introduced for labor, right? Now, there is a possibility, or agricultural labor basically. Now, if I do say, suppose a focus group where different farmers, different agricultural labor is present, there is a possibility that, people who are landlords might dominate the conversation, assuming that they're dominating the conversation. Now, I, as a moderator, can intervene and allow people who are working only as, who are landless and working as agricultural laborers to speak. Now, despite giving that platform, there is still a possibility that they will not reveal their true opinions. The reason being because they are trying to confirm. उनको पता है कि आप तो आज बात करके चले जाएंगे, but उनको काम उसी लैंडलॉर्ड के खेत में जाके करना है, right? So we might, as researchers, have this conversation. We might, push them to reveal certain, aspects which may not go down well with the landlords, for instance. Now, what happens in that process is that people are smart, right? And they know that they were not going to speak up about issues of, say, suppose exploitation by landlord, groups publicly, at least, right? Or in front of researchers, such that so that it's recorded and it's put on pen, it's penned down. Now, that's something that people are aware of. Now, what that does is basically it allows me to understand the influence, but it also allows me to understand the dynamics of this group, of what is really happening. Now, that's why I say it really matters in terms of what are we looking for in a focus group. Now, broadly, that's what focus groups do. There, of course, are limitations of focus groups, and that's why, of course, in social sciences, we've not used them as much. But they're very, very useful tools when you want to get more information quickly, when you want to cover a large group of people, when you want to design certain programs, when you want to design, further research. At least for that aspect, these are crucial tools which should be used, right? Now, if everybody is with me till here, I'll move to the next method. Okay, now the next method I wanted to talk about was the case study method. Now, if you look at case study method, now see, case study is basically in-depth study of cases under consideration. It's just an in-depth study of certain cases, right? Now, when you say case study, a case study is not defined by the tools that you have used. Say, suppose interviews or surveys, it is not defined by the tools. A case study method or a case study is always defined by the interest in the case itself. Now, what that basically means is that in a case study method, you basically use several different techniques. You can use many different techniques in order to study a case. So your case is not going to be defined by whether you've done interviews, whether you've done participant observation. You can actually use an eclectic mix of all of these different methods, but your case study is defined by the specificity or the uniqueness of the case itself, right? And therefore, according to French sociology, case study is a monographic approach, which employs various methods such as interviews, participant observation, field studies, surveys, archival data, government records. All of these different methods can come together in order to study one case, right? Now, to give you a couple of examples of case study methods as well, one of the first case studies in classics that comes to mind is of Malinowski. Now, Malinowski was an anthropologist, and he studied the Trobriand islanders in Melanesia, right? Now, before Malinowski, people used to do what is called as armchair anthropology. Now, armchair anthropology is basically anthropologists or researchers sitting in their swanky offices and then writing about so-called exotic groups, right? Um, Mostly, putting them into a hierarchy where these exotic groups are inferior races, for instance, right? Now, uh, Malinowski challenged this idea of sitting in our offices and doing research, right? He promoted this tradition of fieldwork. So, the tradition of fieldwork or this tradition of ethnographic research or even participant observation starts with Malinowski. Now, in his work on the Trobriand Islanders, the Trobriand society itself was the case, right? So, he looked at their economy, he looked at their kinship, he looked at their rituals, their belief systems, the sexuality, magic, everyday life, all of these aspects he covered. And he lived in the village, he did participant observation. So his primary method of studying the Trobriand society was through participant observation. And he learned the language of the Trobriand Islanders as well. And in part of his research, he documented this famous hula exchange. Now, hula exchange is an interesting exchange that happens among the Trobriand Islanders. Right? It's an exchange of these shell necklaces across islands, and these islanders, what they do is they undertake very dangerous voyages. So there are these small pockets of island almost like in a circle. And what these islanders do is that every year they will undertake these voyages from one island to the other in order to pass these shell necklaces, right? And what the shell necklaces, so Malinowski was quite interested in knowing was that people do this exchange, which is life-threatening in some sense, but it really doesn't, support their survival. They don't need to do all of this in order to survive. It's not necessary for the economy as well. Then why do people do it? And he finally understood through his very in-depth understanding of this case of the Trobriand Islanders, he understood that people undertake these voyages in order to exchange those shell necklaces because it was a matter of pride, it was a matter of status, it was a matter of belief system, it was a matter of maintaining social relationships, right? So now this is an in-depth case study of the Trobriand Islanders. Similarly, there is another person, his name is Frederick Lepley, and he also did a case study, right? So in the 19th century, when Europe was undergoing industrialization, there was a lot of urban migration happening with industrialization. A lot of social unrest also came up in Europe, right? And policymakers were at that point of time very interested in understanding the life of the working class. So Frederick Lepley, what he did is that he studied working class families across Europe. And he didn't do like a survey, but he did very in-depth documentation of household budgets, incomes and expenditures, work routines, moral values, kinship ties, social relationships, religious life, obligations, etc. And he did this through the use of interviews and observations. Now, in this particular example, every family was a case, or every family was a monograph. Does anybody have a question? No? Okay. All right. Now, this is another example of case study. Similarly, if you look at, say, suppose the Chicago school, right? And we had talked about um, William Footwhite's Street Corner Society, right? So basically, if you look at Chicago school came up in the early 20th century because Chicago was experiencing massive immigration in the 20th century, early 20th century. And with massive immigration, there was also segregation that was happening. Crime was increasing, poverty was increasing with rapid growth. Now, for Chicago school, the Chicago school basically came up to study Chicago. So Chicago in itself became a case, right? And within Chicago, neighborhoods, gangs, migrant community, homeless population, street workers, all of these were, again, cases within this larger case of Chicago, where researchers have used participant observation, they've used interviews, they've used life stories, they've used mapping methods. So I talked about positional maps. All of that comes from Chicago school. Now, if you look at these three examples of Malinowski, of Frederick Lepley, and the Chicago school, there's one thing that's very clear about case study method, that it's a very versatile method. So in one case, a village is a case. In the other, research, a family is a case. In the third research, a city is a case, right? So you can do a case study of a variety of things, right? So, but the important thing again, you have to remember, you're using multiple methods or you're using multiple tools in order to study in depth one particular case. And that case is defined by your interest or by the interest of that specific case. What does it tell you, right? What is so special about this case? So in that sense, case study method is, it's not a tool. It's basically a method within which you will have several tools in order to study that case. Okay. Now, in identifying, how do you identify a case? Not everything is a case. For a case study method, not anything and everything can be considered as a case. There are two features of a case that are crucial. One is specificity. The second is pattern behavior. Now, when you look at specificity, according to Smith, a case is always a bounded system. Now, when I say bounded system, it basically means that whatever case that you've picked up needs to have a clear boundary either in space, right? So it can be, say, suppose a particular locality, it can be a particular village. In case of Malinowski, for instance, it was the Trobriand Islanders, or Chicago School looked at Chicago. So in terms of space, it has to be bounded, or it can be bounded, for instance, in terms of time. Say, suppose I'm trying to do a case study of the time period of COVID or Holocaust. A specific time period is when it can be bounded. It can be bounded by certain actors or by social processes that you're trying to study. So it has to be, there has to be some boundary that defines the limit of this case. And the second aspect, that there has to be patterned behavior, that there has to be some consistency and sequentialness in this case. So we're not studying random events. We are studying processes that unfold in very structured ways, right? So there has to be this pattern or consistency that has to emerge within this case. Now, therefore, ultimately, when you're doing a case study, it is both a process of learning and it is also the end product. So you also, you case study is also a method, but case study is also the output. The final thing that you will write is also called a case study. All right, with me till here? Okay, now in identifying a case, there are several different, kinds of cases that you can look at. Just to give you a sense, I'm putting this here. Now, the first is called an intrinsic case study. Now, intrinsic case study is when the case in itself is of interest. So, say suppose Malinowski's study of Trobriand Islanders, it's called the Agronauts of Western Pacific. Now that in itself, Agronauts of Western Pacific itself is, important or interesting to study, and that's why Malinowski has taken this up, and that's why it's called a case study, right? You can similarly do a case study of, say, suppose a particular person, right? Or you can do a case study of a particular event. So the case in itself is important. The second type is when you have an instrumental case study. Now, instrumental case study is when the case provides insight into an issue or it refines theory. So, for example, when you look at Chicago School, now Chicago School was studying issues, as I said, of migration, urbanization, and the consequences of, say, suppose crime coming up, poverty, etc. So Chicago and the various studies that happened in Chicago were basically instrumental case studies in order to understand these emerging issues in Chicago, right? Lastly is the collective case study, when an instrumental study is extended to many cases, right? So when you're doing an instrumental case study across several different cases. So Frederick Lee plays research on the working class families can be thought of as an example of collective case studies. So he did several case studies of several families of working class group, right? Now, of course, also please remember, it's not as if there are these tightly defined categories. There will always be overlap. So when you're doing an intrinsic case study, there will be certain issues that that case study will highlight, right? So there will always be overlap, but then of course, broadly, you can see these as the types of case studies. Now, when you are studying a case study, what all, as researchers, what all should we keep in mind while we are studying this case? Now, any case study will cover or will focus on both what is common as well as what is particular or what is specific, right? And therefore, the ultimate purpose for a case study is to present uniqueness of something, right? Uniqueness of that particular case. By talking about, of course, components that are common, that are general, but also components that are very specific to this particular case, right? So as researchers, we should, when we are studying a case, focus on the nature of the case, the historical background of this case, the physical setting of the case should be understood. If there are other contexts or other cases that inform this particular case, those should also be studied. And also those informants through which the case can be known better, right? All of these aspects should be documented. All of these aspects should be studied. Now, uh, despite the wide variety of things that you can actually do using a case study method, or the kind of diversity that a case study method can present, it is again regarded or disregarded, basically not as a very important qualitative method, or not used as much as other methods such as interviews or participant observation are used, particularly because there is this one criticism that always comes to case study method, that because it is so specific, because it's so micro, you cannot generalize. Now here again, I will reiterate what I had said in the first session, that even with one small case study, you can generalize, right? You can talk about, again, see, because we are generalizing not to the population, unlike in more statistical study, we are not generalizing to populations, we are generalizing to the issue that we are studying. And case study, therefore, is a small step towards those grand generalizations. It actually adds value because it's so in depth, because it talks about the specificity and it talks about the uniqueness of that particular case. It actually adds much more value to the theory or to the issue that we are trying to study. And therefore, as a method, it becomes indispensable to highlight uniqueness of certain situations in a storytelling method, right? Now, okay. All right. Now, so the last part of case studies now, which is basically when you start as researchers or people who are working in projects, when you write case studies, or even policymakers, for instance, who are writing reports, I suppose, for the government. How do you write case studies, right? Now, the case study methods and qualitative methods in general believe that knowledge is socially constructed, right? And if you look at case study method in particular here, because we come with this understanding that knowledge is socially constructed, researchers will always write their work keeping in mind that they have to assist their readers in construction of knowledge, right? Now, what do you mean by this construction of knowledge? We had discussed this, but just to reiterate it, see, the first level of construction of knowledge happens when, say, suppose I'm having an interview with somebody. So when I ask questions, people think, people reflect, people recollect, and they will formulate their answers. That's the first level of construction of knowledge, which is an interpretation of the people themselves, right? The second level of interpretation or construction of knowledge happens when I, as a researcher, having talked to so many people, having collected so much data, write my report, write my thesis, write my dissertation, right? That's the second level. The third level also exists. Now, the third level is when people who read my work, right? People who read my thesis, people who read my articles or reports, right? When they read, they also take from what has been written and interpret my research according to themselves, right? That's the third layer, and that's what is essential for a case study method. So when you're writing case studies, particularly, there are two parts that should be categorically remembered while writing case studies. One is the first method where, as a researcher, I am taking on the responsibility of teacher, right? So as a teacher, I have to tell my readers what has been learned. So I will express my personal interpretation of the events, of the relationship, of the phenomena that I'm studying. Whatever I understood, whatever I analyzed, that has to be presented. That is what something we usually do, right? But what case study does is that it acknowledges that not everything has to be informed and not everything should be informed for your readers, particularly. I'm not saying to withhold information, I'm saying that not everything has to be communicated uh, in entirety, right? And that's where the second part of case study comes in, which is the discovery learning. Now, discovery learning basically says that as a researcher, while providing my interpretation, my understanding, I should also provide material for readers to learn on their own, which is to say that any reader who's reading my work will add, subtract, invent or reshape whatever case study I've presented. Essentially, basically, they, in this process, they will reconstruct this case study in a manner that leaves it, differently connected and more personally useful for the reader, right? Now, that is why, because the second element is equally crucial for case studies. When we are doing case studies, it is important to remember that we don't misrepresent or misinterpret or misrepresent people, which is why this triangulation becomes important. So when you're doing case study, I mentioned there's several different techniques that you would have used in order to triangulate information as well. All of that information should be presented in thick description, in detail. Whatever information is there, whether it is numbers, statistical figures, government reports, people's opinions, all of these aspects should in detail be presented to your reader for them to have that scope of seeing how they want to engage with this case study. And naturally, one aspect of case studies is that mostly, case studies are used in reporting such that they're written in a style where you can compare two case studies, right? Where you can compare. Now, unfortunately, what happens when we write with the idea that this is going to be used only for comparison is that we get fixated, our attention is fixated on only certain attributes which we know we will be compared, right? As against writing in thick description, as against providing all the details, all the evidence, all the rich information that we've collected. Instead of doing that, we only fixate on those aspects which become comparable across case studies. Don't do that, right? Again, in order for you to assist your readers to learn on their own, to experiment and engage on their own, it's very, very crucial in case study method to give thick descriptions, to give detailed understanding of the cases. As much information as possible should be given of any particular case. I hope that is also clear, because then I'll move to the last bit of the session. So, see, I'm just basically doing these different methods, as I said, because there's no technique per se that needs to be taught. In case study, you are again using those same methods of participant observation and interviews, for instance, right? So, but as tools, they're crucial, of course, less used, unfortunately, but they're very crucial in terms of your research. They're under rated as methods, and that's why I thought it'd be interesting to bring up these particular methods. Now, talking about underrated methods, I also thought I would very quickly talk a little bit about participatory methods. Now, if you look at participatory methods, why does so if you look at development, the history of development, and it's since it started across several countries, across several communities, despite so many years of development, why is it that development research, and there's been so much of research that is produced day in and day out, despite so much research, despite so much knowledge that has been created through research, yet we fail certain people, yet we fail the poor, right? Why is that the case? Now, the reason is that why our research is not able to produce the results? Why is it not able to feed into policy the way, or even if policies actually make use of research, why is it that even policies then fail to bring out results that are necessary, right? Now, one of the many reasons for that is that there is always a possibility that our research creates a false picture of reality, right? And there are certain biases in development research which leads to this false picture of reality. The first is the spatial bias. Now, spatial bias is basically, as researchers, we look at our convenience, and we will look at sites that are spatially convenient for us to study. So for instance, sadak ke along jo gaon hai, we'll study villages that are along the highway because it's easier to travel to, right? We will never think of, looking at a village that is not connected by the road network at all. You will not, or not as much research will happen on very remote locations, right? Now that what that does, that spatial bias does, is whatever research is coming out is biased towards these certain areas, certain villages, certain pockets, right? So basically, accessibility, spatial accessibility becomes one important aspect when people are trying to identify and pin down their field areas, right? That creates bias in research. The second bias is called the professional bias. Now, professional bias basically says that outsiders, or people like us who are researchers, who are experts in certain fields, or consultants, will define what problems people are facing, right? So we will define if people are poor or not. We will define if there is exploitation or not, right? We will define if, or our methods, our ways of understanding will define what are the problems in the society that we have decided to study. Now that's a professional bias, right? So in that process, what happens, we become people who know everything, and local people who will be our respondents are only respondents. We ethically also it's wrong, because you deny people any cognitive capacity. It's almost as if people who are being studied mostly in, say suppose rural areas, don't have cognitive capacity to think about what's happening with them in their life, and we are the ones who have all the knowledge to tell them that, okay, this is wrong with your life, right? Now that's a professional bias. In fact, if you look at development, the history of development, you will see much of development happens through these development agencies, these development experts, right? And these experts, go from one place to the other, one project to the other, and it's almost like development tourism, right? So you're hopping from one place to the other. Unfortunately, the results on ground, don't tend to produce results that we expect. The third is, of course, the seasonal bias. Now, the seasonal bias is again similar to spatial bias. We will do fieldwork when it's convenient for us, at a time when it's convenient. So, not when the realities of field actually emerge. So, for instance, I would want to go and do research in Himachal when it's okay, when it's not the monsoon season. In the monsoon season, there are too many landslides. So I'll just decide that, oh my God, it's too risky for me. I'm not going to go to Himachal at that stage, right? Or for instance, during a drought period, I will decide that, okay, this is a drought period, not a great time. I'm going to focus at something else. I'll go to my research site sometime else when things get better, right? And that's again a seasonal bias. Uh, the fourth bias that emerges in development research is called the social bias. Now, social bias is when you get to field. Uh, this is also the gatekeeping aspect that we had talked of. Very often, people who are doing development, who are experts in development, what happens is that they're either in hurry because we have deadlines, we have so many different things to do, or they're never able to actually see through the reality that gatekeepers create. That what ultimately happens is that we only talk to the influential people. We will only talk to men. We will only talk to the sarpanch. We will only talk to these gatekeepers. We will only talk to landlords, for instance, right? Nobody will approach women. Nobody would want to talk to children, for instance. And based on this partial understanding conversation that we've had with men or landowners or elites, for instance, we formulate our research, analysis. We produce certain results. That results are taken up for policy, and of course, policies are created which do not reflect the ground reality, and naturally, policies then fail, right? The last bias is the conceptual bias, which is where, as we had talked earlier in one of the sessions, several development categories, say suppose poverty, poverty line, for instance, or incomes, or productivity, or employment, all of these development categories that have been created by us may not match with how people live their life, right? And may not explain their experiences, say suppose with poverty, right? So that is a conceptual bias. So I might say that somebody who's I don't know the exact benchmark now, but say suppose, $2 per day, somebody above that is basically above poverty line, right? You're not poor, right? Now, that may not be the actual experience of somebody on ground. They might, by categorization, they may not fall into the category of below poverty line, but they may lead very precarious lives, right? Now, that's what conceptual bias does. And when you have these very rigid categories or concepts coming into research, which again are then taken up by policies, then policy will only focus largely on people who are below poverty line, leaving those group of people who are living this very precarious life where one thing goes wrong and you're suddenly below the poverty line, right? Now that's a conceptual bias. Now all of these things have existed in development research for very, very long. And it's in response to this that in 1960s and 80s, in response to this very top-down approach of development, that participatory methods came up, right? And in participatory methods, people are not looked at as objects of research. They are producers of knowledge instead. Now, among the several proponents of participatory methods, one of the most important has been Robert Chambers. And for those who are interested in studying participatory methods, I would recommend this book, which is called Revolutions in Scientific Inquiry. I think it's Revolutions in Scientific Inquiry, which will help you understand of how you can actually do participatory methods. Now, he also introduced participatory rural appraisal. Now, before we get into the actual methods, some of the key principles of participatory methods. The first is that there is reversal of learning, right? That is to say that outsiders learn from insiders. So instead of getting information, extracting information from people or respondents and leaving, and then just taking credit for all the research that has been done, we as researchers instead learn from the insiders, right? So people are given the capacity, they are restored with the cognitive um, coevalness in terms of deciding what issues need to be studied. People will tell us that, okay, this is the problem in our place, this is what needs to be addressed, this is what needs to be researched, right? So they will decide what needs to be studied and how it has to be studied. The second principle is called as handing over the stick. Now, handing over the stick basically means the pen, right? So basically that means communities control representation and analysis. Now that is where, in terms of data collection or when you're creating knowledge, people will say, suppose, take the pen and draw the maps. They will create timelines. They will categorize people into different social categories, right? Or they will rank the issues, etc. So knowledge production is then in people's hand, right? And that's what handing over the stick means. Thirdly, it's of course a collective reflection where knowledge is co-produced. Now, naturally, people collectively discuss and arrive at mutual understanding about any issue, whether certain aspect is an issue or not, what needs to be studied. It's a collective process of people themselves, right? Of course, with us, but also amongst themselves, and therefore it's a co-production of knowledge. The fourth, naturally, it's very specific to them and to their context, right? So it's contextual and situated understanding of a particular issue. And lastly, there is long-term ethical engagement. Now, any participatory method cannot be done in a haste, right? It requires patience. It requires a long-term engagement. So very often you would have, projects that use participatory method, which have a very long engagement in terms of, from beginning from problem identification to moving to data collection to results, co-production of results, to even evaluation of projects. So it's a very long engagement that happens collectively with the people. So ultimately what you're doing is you're avoiding any kind of extractive behavior where you're just treating people as this laboratory from which information has to be collected by us as researchers, and we go back, write, publish papers, get a lot of citations. That's not how it is, right? So there has to be transparency in research, as well as whatever the findings are, there will be shared ownership of findings. So I've come across several articles now where researchers have actually, if not as the first author, at least as the second or third author, they would have people who've given information to them as authors, right? So there's also shared ownership of finding, or even say, suppose in my one of my studies that I was doing in Himachal, there was this information that I collected on people's knowledge of biodiversity, and it's work in progress. But the idea is basically to have this information collected and then handed over back to the community to keep for themselves as record, because much of these knowledge is oral, right? It's passed down orally, and therefore there are no documents that are maintained. So if, say, suppose, researchers could do this, then that's beneficial mutually, right? Now, to talk about some of the methods that are used in participatory methods, the first is participatory mapping. Now, this is something we had discussed when we had done observation, when we specifically talked about how do you observe. So in participatory mapping, very simply, community members draw on their own the maps of a village, or say, suppose, the map of a landscape. Where are the resources located? Which are the risky areas? Say, suppose, mapping of institutions, etc. Where the community is basically sitting down together, interacting with each other, and drawing these maps. The second is called transect walks. Now, transect walks is when the researchers walks through, say, certain section of the village, or when you are walking through a certain patch of the forest with local people, and that path is basically chosen by the people themselves. And in that walk, you observe and you discuss, say, suppose, changes in the housing patterns, or you discuss about changes in the soil patterns, or you discuss changes in terms of effects of landslide, changes in cropping patterns, or say, suppose, changes in forest covers or wildlife, right? Or changes in livelihoods. So it's walking and discussing along a route which has been chosen. The third is seasonal calendars. Now, in seasonal calendars, communities chart out activities, right? So activities in the sense, there could be agricultural seasons, there could be seasons of labor, seasons of income, seasons of hunger, right? Seasons of illness. So, there'll be certain time periods when hunger increases, illness increases, say, suppose, layoff increases, right? Or even can be seasons in terms of, say, suppose, seasons of rainfall, or seasons when migration patterns or migration increases. Now, seasonal calendars is when community draws from January to December. How do these different issues, change? What is the variation? So those are seasonal calendars. Now, the fourth is wealth ranking. Now, in wealth ranking, instead of us going with preconceived ideas that, okay, this much income and below, category 1, this much income and above, category 2. So instead of us having these categorizations, in wealth ranking, villagers will themselves classify households into categories like, of course, very poor, middle, rich, right? But when they classify, it is based on local criteria. So for instance, my categorization as a researcher of wealth can be based on simply, say, income, right? But if you go to Himachal, okay, if you go to Kullu area, for instance, I'm sure other places as well, but in Kullu, because I've been there, if you ask somebody who's the wealthy person, so they will not talk about land, they will not talk about income. What they talk about, or how do they assess, what is the criteria on the basis of which they assess wealth? It's the sheep, right? So in their language, they call it mal. So basically, it's people who are with the highest number of livestock who are considered as the wealthiest, right? So these criterias of ranking are determined by people. Then next is problem ranking. In problem ranking, again, community prepares a list of problems that, say, suppose, their society has or their village has, and they will rank which problem needs addressing first, which problems are not as urgent. Now, for NGOs that are working, right, especially those who are starting, this is problem ranking is an extremely important tool, specifically for NGOs that are working on a holistic dimension of, say, suppose, rural development. Because what problem ranking does is that in a very participatory manner, you are able to understand from people what are the issues that need to be addressed immediately, what are issues that can be pushed a little further down the line, right? Now, why is that? Why am I saying that it's useful for organizations or NGOs that are working, say, suppose in rural development? Is because it increases the chances that if you now bring in a program or a project or a scheme that addresses the concerns or people or issues that people feel are urgently requiring attention, then people will of course take to it more, right? Because it's an immediate requirement of people, but that immediate requirement can only be known to you only if you talk to people and let them take charge in terms of determining this ranking. Then there are community timelines. Now, community timelines, what they do is that people can collectively sit and reconstruct major events in their community's history. Say, suppose, when did the drought happen, or when did the displacements happen? What policy changes happened at what point of time, and how did that, leave a significant impact on your village, or when did certain conflicts happen, or when did certain development projects come in. Now, what that does is that people will collectively sit together in order to recollect and then write down a timeline of how their community has changed, right, and what has led to these changes. And then lastly is what is called as institutional Venn diagrams. This is something that I use very frequently. In institutional Venn diagrams, you can basically represent various institutions and actors in a particular setting. And how you do it is that you use circles, right? So you use circles. I'm sure you know what Venn diagrams are. And you represent different institutions and actors through circles. Now, starting from the center of, say, suppose a particular canvas, how far, what is the size of the circle, and how far away from the center is a particular circle will determine the the importance, the accessibility, or the influence of certain institutions. So there is a possibility. So just to give an example, when I started my PhD research, I had done this aspect of institutional Venn diagrams when I did stakeholder mapping in Kulu, and I realized that at the center of this entire picture were, of course, the forest department. There were other line departments. Interestingly, to me, tourism department, according to people, was very important, right? But there were several other departments or several other actors that were on the periphery. Now that really determines, or that really gives you an insight in terms of how do people view different institutions, different actors in context of the phenomena that you are trying to study. Now, those are broadly some of the methods that you can actually use for participatory methods. I've deliberately not gone into detail of these methods because, of course, that will require more time, and this is a more hands-on experience that has to be brought in, right? If you want to learn participatory methods. But yes, if there are people who are interested, this also can be arranged. A separate session maybe on participatory methods can be arranged. But that's it from my side. So I'll stop this here, and if there are questions, if there are discussions, comments, anything, please feel free to, we have time now, but also here's my email ID, and if you wish to write to me, I'll be very happy to talk to you. Right, thank you. Okay. Yes, so if there are questions.
We are open to Q&A, so I request everyone to please come up with their questions now.
Yeah. Any questions?
Yeah. Continue, ma'am.
No, if there are any questions, have you posted on the chat box, is it?
Yeah, one question is there. Does institutional Venn diagrams develop based on relational approach?
So relational approach in the sense, Sumed, right? So you basically meaning in the sense of how different people would relate to different institutions. Is that what you mean?
Sumedh, are you there?
Okay, in case if that is what you mean, then of course, yes, of course. So, um, importance of different actors and different institutions will be different for different categories of people, right? So I might feel that as somebody who's already in a position of power, who already is has decent wealth, for instance, I might not feel the need of a lot of government support, right? So for me a lot of government departments may not be very important, so I might not rank them, or I might not present them as being very important, or access to them might not be very important for me. But somebody who's really dependent on government services, right, or government support, for them, their entire life, for them in their picture, of course, the government services, the government departments will play a very crucial role. So yes, it depends people to people, but then usually when we do this process, it's done collectively. So it's not based on one person's opinion generally. It's more broadly consensus that has to be built across people. Yeah, I hope that helps. Okay. Any other questions? Any other comments also for that matter? Has anybody used participatory methods? Does anybody intend to use participatory methods? Yes, Archana, please.
Yes, so I've been using participatory methods for a bit, and
Okay.
yeah. I mean, so it feels like I mean, it's an important way to do research, especially when one is going into a community which one does not understand very well.
Mm, mm,
Um, you know, I've also used it in quite a few evaluation studies to help communities and groups talk about what they thought the outcomes of a particular project or a process are.
mhm,
Yeah. So it's in a sense, it's been a little utilitarian in that sense, right? Because many of these processes are time bound, and ideally one
yeah.
has to do many iterations,
Mm,
to get the voices of various groups involved.
right.
If we had time, I was interested in exploring how we think about participatory methods, which we try to do as part of a focus group discussion, right? And
Okay.
yeah, so for instance,
Mhm,
recently we were trying to do powers of, freedom, no, ladders of freedom and power
mhm,
within a focus group discussion. We are basically talking to women about how they thought their agency had changed across a period of time when a
mhm,
process, you know, when a process tried to work with them through capacity building programs, certain
mhm,
subsidies, etc. Um, so so it was interesting that today we consider them as two different kinds of methods, the participatory methods and focus group discussions. Um,
mm,
so would love to hear how you think about, embedding one within the other.
mm, mm. No, that's interesting. In fact, I mean, that's food for thought for me as well, because I think you can actually use some of these methods that we've just talked about, of participatory methods in focus groups also. So focus group
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily, I feel, have to be, in terms of just having conversations. You could actually have like these,
Yeah,
the aspect of stimuli, right? You can actually
yeah,
bring in these workshop mode focus groups actually, where you have, say,
yeah.
suppose people are drawing problem trees, for instance, or
Hmm.
mapping out, or conceptually putting this idea of agency that you've talked about, of how it has changed, or in what aspects it has changed, or how much it has changed in certain aspects, and in certain aspects probably they feel that not as much change. Now that can actually be
Hmm.
done in a more game like format as well,
Yeah, yeah.
instead of just doing like an interaction or an interview. So definitely, I think participatory methods can then be brought into focus groups as well. In fact, I think
Mm.
it will enrich focus groups much more, and as moderators, it might, in fact, be easier for us also to ensure that people talk or people express. Which, of course, when you're doing interactions, there can be some level of hesitancy. But if you have these newer methods of doing focus groups, then that'll be an interesting way to do it. Yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Important tips of blending with tribal communities. Okay, see, one of the first aspects of when you're studying not just tribal communities but any community is language. And I'm sure you would have heard it from several other places as well, that in order to be able to communicate effectively as a researcher, specifically if you have time and if you can afford that, you have the luxury of time, try and learn their language a little bit. Try and spend time. So in ethnographic studies, in the initial few months at least that's what I do. I don't focus on my research at all. All I'm trying to do is to gel with the community. Just observe, just see what people do. Find a place where you think you can live, where you can stay, and gradually it builds up. Right? Just start trying to adapt your life, your rhythm of your life with that of people. Start going out with them. If this community engages in agriculture, you might actually volunteer to go and help them on one particular day, attend their events. So a little bit of these everyday activities have to be done in terms of initiating your research process. So because you mentioned ethnographic research, I'm assuming that you have time. So engage. A couple of other interesting aspects of getting into a community, and my teachers usually would say this. One is that one good way of getting into communities to start engaging with children. So if you're going to a tribal community, the easiest entry is usually through children. Interact with children. In fact, they might teach the language. So for me, for instance, when I went to Kullu, I didn't learn as much of the Pahadi language through the elders in that place as much as I did with one of this, young student in class 10th. So young girl, right? So I would get along with her and just, roam around, see the places, go to the market. And then she would, constantly start teaching me things. And that's where I, grasped. And those aspects. One other instance where people say of how do you normalize your presence into field. So one of my doctoral advisors, for instance, recommends that you find a place where you can go and sit and observe and let people observe you. So in most cases, an ideal place is a market. If you're going to a tribal community, find out where their market is, right, or where a lot of footfall is. Just go and be there. Let people see you 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, week. Let them come and approach you. Let them come and talk to you, because people are quite inquisitive in terms of who's this new face. So they will generally come and speak to you. But take it slow. Of course, you will have to give it time, and much of your research actually happens in this process of trying to get into the field. Much of your research, you will not even realize it, but you will learn more about your field in these everyday activities than through interviews, probably. Right? I don't know if that helps, but yeah, some of those aspects should be kept in mind when you're going to your field. Anybody else?
Hello, ma'am. I have a question.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, my focus is on the combined environmental and social issues faced by the tribal communities in Vidarbha.
Okay.
I anticipate challenges with the power dynamics, such as the presence of local influencers, sarpanches, or corporate officers
Mhm.
who provide temporary jobs and may dominate the conversation.
Okay.
Ma'am, what is the best approach to like ensure the reach data collection in the setting or prevent these figures from controlling the discussion? Like you already like said about this, but I need to like get how should I do it?
See, controlling the discussion of, for instance, this idea of gatekeepers is there everywhere, right? Everywhere you go, you will have these people who will try to paint a picture of what this place is like or what is this issue like, right? And most likely, that whatever that picture is painted serves their interest, right? Now the idea is for you to be able to understand, and that's why things like focus groups, for instance, can be helpful. Or when you spend more time in field, there will be instances where you will realize that what is being presented to you is not the entire picture. There can be certain, say suppose, conflicts that break out, or there can be certain events that happen where you realize that okay, not the entire community feels the same way, and you identify that there are these people who think differently or articulate about this issue very differently, and gradually you will have to distance yourself from the so-called gatekeepers. And I'll give you an example of this. And there is backlash also. You have to be prepared for that. Now, for instance, when I started my research in Kullu, I initiated with some of the forest officials because they were the easiest to get access to, and they were quite helpful. They told me about the entire working of the forest related issues that I was looking at, the landscape and conservation issues that I was looking at. But then I put my foot down and I said that no, I want to go and stay with anybody in a village, that I'm not going to continue to stay in a guest house, but I want to stay with somebody in the village. And of course they even they helped me even with that. But over a period of 1 year, I realized there was some sort of, backlash that I was facing in terms of, a lot of same people who had helped me earlier uh, publicly would come and tell me that, oh, you are with the wrong kind of people, right? Or my supervisor, for instance, Professor Hebar, would narrate this story where she studied tribes in Jharkhand, and she mentioned of how she again also insisted that she wants to go and stay in the tribal hamlet itself, and there were these officials who asked her that, for instance, what is that you want to study there? There is information that we can provide you. All that is to be known is already available, and we'll give this information to you. And she said, no, but because I'm doing this research, I want to go and study there. And so even comments would come our way, specifically for women maybe. But so for instance, she was at the receiving end of this comment where people said that, what is it that you want to study at night which you can't study in the day, right? So why is it that you want to go and live in a tribal hamlet where people are believed to be drunk and they don't know their boundaries or whatever? So as a woman, why do you want to do it, right? Now that is a stand that you will have to take. Eventually you will have to take a call to distance yourself from gatekeepers and move towards other people who you feel are not being represented as much in your research. That you will have to do gradually. uh, People will also understand. So that's a process that unfolds in the research. You have to identify who's being left out, who's not being presented in your findings up till now, and then of course talk to them. I
Sure,
don't
ma'am.
know if
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. Okay, anybody else? All right. Okay, email ID. Okay, I'll put my email ID here. But if there are more questions, I'll be happy to take them now. Or even just generally feedback about the sessions as well. I hope it has been helpful for you to at least initiate your process. See, the thing with qualitative research is, as even if I, take an entire course on qualitative research, yet when you go to your field, you'll feel absolutely blank, probably, right? Because in qualitative research, at least, I'm sure in other researches, but at least in qualitative research, because the nature of what you're studying is so that ultimately it always comes down to what you do in your field and how do you maneuver the constraints, the conflicts, the loopholes. So much of your research is going to be like in waves, right? There'll be periods of frustration where you'll feel like you're not getting anywhere, you're not understanding anything, people are not responding to you. But then also there'll be phases where things will pick up, right? But it needs patience. So hopefully some of these discussions might help them. And feel free if you want to, at any point of time, come back and discuss. But yes, any more questions, then I'll take it. Otherwise, we can wrap up. Shantanu and Pankaj, what do we do?
So I guess it's a wrap up now. I guess they don't have any more questions.
All right.
Actually, idea was that because in such kind of setup online, we give last 20 to 25 minutes to ask what they have any if they have any doubt or any problem related to their work. But I guess just we received few questions, so we can wrap up or we can ask once again if anybody has. Don't hesitate. I mean, unmute
Yeah,
yourself and
please.
go ahead.
Even if you have, for instance, insights from your work, I'll be very happy to hear. Okay, yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring in that, I mean, of course, we've talked about some of these methods as research methods, but I think many of us have also been using it in interventions, right? And
Of course. Yes.
yeah, so I mean, it's a thin line, but many of the principles are similar. Yeah, and personally, I found focus group discussions to be very powerful intervention tools.
Absolutely.
Even in terms of witnessing how a community wants to consider a question, address a problem, think about what's tripping them up, and I mean, of course, then there are it's a series. One has to think of it as a series of focus group discussions, and sometimes it's interesting as a facilitator to see the movement from one discussion to another. But but there are instances when there is no movement, and it can be sort of frustrating as well. So I just wanted to bring that to the table as well, and I thought it was interesting some of the things that we said. So as researchers' notes, we talked about how researchers' notes are very important, and being upfront about the biases that we bring into a process. So as an intervener, also I find it's kind of similar. And,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, just wanted to.
No, that's a very valid point. So, of course, I mean, we've talked about this in context of more research oriented method, but yes, you're absolutely right that even in intervention, for instance, many of these methods become quite useful, and the insights that you've shared are, of course, wonderful. So yes, thank you.
No, I'd also just like to say that this has been very useful. I've been a student of qualitative methods for a while, but like you said, there are always newer dimensions of it, and every conversation is useful even in revisiting what one thinks one is doing, and how it's going in the field. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the discussion.
Most welcome. I'm glad you found this useful. Okay. Yes, Sumit, please.
मैम लास्टली मुझे बस थैंक यू कहना था बिकॉज ड्यूरिंग माई मास्टर्स रिसर्च मैंने क्वालिटेटिव स्टडीज पे फोकस किया था बट माय गाइड ड्यूरिंग टीएसएस डेज मुझे समय नहीं दे सके बट ड्यूरिंग दिस सेशन और सर का भी मुझे थैंक यू कहना था और रिसर्च वाइज प्लेटफॉर्म का भी बिकॉज इसी वजह से मुझे बहुत क्लियरिटी मिली है रिगार्डिंग विद माय रिसर्च सो थैंक यू सो मच मैम.
Most welcome. I'm glad this is helping. And of course, yes, thank you to Research Wise. This is wonderful that they're able to connect so many people from so different backgrounds together. It really adds, more depth to what we know about qualitative methods and all other sessions, I'm sure. Thank you, of course, to Pankaj and the entire team as well. And thank you, of course, to all of you. This has been wonderful for me. I get to learn a lot interacting with all of you. So it's always a pleasure to come for such sessions. So thank you so much. And I hope we continue to engage, in other sessions or even otherwise, offline, online, physically, if you're there in Bombay sometime. I'd be very happy to meet and discuss with all of you. Pankaj, I think we'll wrap up.
Yeah, sure. We can wrap up. From my side also, I want to thank everyone. And the idea was that to bring people from different discipline and working in the development sector, not just online. Anybody can attend from any corner of country. So that's really wonderful, and it was interactive session. I myself enjoyed it very much. So thank you so much. Thanks to every participant. A special thank to Aditi Bhardwaj ma'am for accepting our invitation. And of course, we are looking forward to have such more workshop and collaboration with you. Thank you so much. Santanu, I think it's over to you now.
Yeah, so once again, before we formally conclude today's workshop, as it was the last lecture, I would express our sincere gratitude to Professor Aditi Bhardwaj. And meanwhile, I would also like to express my thanks to all the participants for doing such an active engagement, thoughtful questions, and consistent participation. I remember that we started with about 100 people, and the numbers had quite been consistent here. So, although we had 60, 70 participants today also, but yeah, well, that shows that people were enjoying and something meaningful was coming out of it, because generally you don't have such numbers coming on all the days of a workshop. So yeah, thank you to everyone, and thank you again, ma'am, for taking us through the journey of qualitative research.
Most welcome.
I hope that will be great for everyone, and yeah, that's a wrap then.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Happy New Year in advance to everybody. All right. Bye.
You can all leave the meeting room.
Thank you so much.